A Rocky Beginning. Emily Turner checked her watch as she strode across the bustling lobby of Hartsfield & Coing, one of New York's major consulting firms. The morning rush was a cacophony of clacking heels, elevator dings, and snippets of small talk. Emily, the youngest manager promoted to her position in years, was known for her sharp mind and unyielding work ethic. Yet, despite her talent, she had learned to keep her ambition quiet. Years in the corporate world had taught her that outspokenness was rarely rewarded if it came from the wrong person. Her office, perched in a glass-walled corner overlooking Lower Manhattan, should have been a testament to her achievements. Instead, it felt like a fishbowl, transparent, exposed, and oddly isolating. Emily grabbed her coffee, glancing at the framed family photo on her desk, before pulling up the project files for the morning meeting. Months of late nights and meticulous preparation had gone into the Btch bid, the company's most ambitious endeavor that fiscal year. At 8:15 a.m., the floor manager sent out a calendar alert, an impromptu meeting in Conference Room A, called by Richard Wallace, the division vice president. Richard's reputation preceded him, a master strategist, but ruthless, calculating, and widely rumored to show little compassion for female colleagues. Emily had often wondered if the whispered warnings about him were exaggerated, or if she was simply lucky never to have crossed him, until now. As the team gathered, Emily's pulse quickened. Richard paced at the front, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. One by one, staff members recited their portions of the Btch report. When her turn arrived, Emily summarized her analysis, careful but confident, highlighting the pain points she'd uncovered and the innovative solutions she proposed. She looked over at Richard, hoping for even a faint nod of acknowledgement. Instead, Richard narrowed his eyes and proceeded to question the foundation of Emily's findings, dismissing her data as speculative and overcomplicated. His tone was icy, his words clipped, making the air in the room grow dense with silent discomfort. No one spoke up in her defense. Instead, colleagues exchanged awkward glances or scribbled notes, heads lowered. After the meeting, Emily lingered, staring at the conference table scattered with untouched coffee cups. Memories of her tireless work on Btch felt like shards. Each late night, each revised spreadsheet, now reduced to background noise. It wasn't the first time her contributions had been downplayed, but this public invalidation cut deeper than the backhanded comments she'd become accustomed to. Back at her desk, she read through her emails, spotting one with the subject line, Project Credit Allocation. The message confirmed her worst fears. Credit for the most critical section of the Btch proposal, the portion she had authored independently, had been attributed to a male colleague with barely a passing knowledge of her work. A cold wave washed over her. The pattern was unmistakable. Throughout the day, Emily observed more of the unstated laws that ruled her office. The upper management team, overwhelmingly male, moved between closed-door meetings and private lunches. Mentorships and handshakes sealed over glasses of bourbon rarely included her or the few other women in similar positions. She could sense an invisible ceiling above her head, a barrier that no amount of performance could shatter if she remained alone. Despite finishing her workday with her usual meticulous care, Emily left the office that evening with an unfamiliar heaviness. The city's skyline, once a symbol of promise, suddenly looked harsh and uninviting through her windshield as she drove home. She thought of her parents' immigrant journey to the U.S., the sacrifices and lessons about integrity and perseverance. Emily knew she could not allow this rocky beginning to define her story. But at this moment, she wasn't sure where to begin changing the ending. The height of injustice. In the days that followed the disastrous team meeting, a heavy, invisible fog seemed to settle around Emily. The air in the office crackled with a tension she couldn't quite name, but felt everywhere she went. Her footsteps down the corridor seemed louder. Casual hallway conversations faded as she approached, replaced by sidelong glances and too quickly whispered exchanges she wasn't meant to hear. It began subtly. Emily noticed strange hesitations in her colleagues' voices. A friendly analyst who once invited her for coffee now scrolled through his phone when she entered the break room. Her inbox, once vibrant with collaboration, now filled with terse, impersonal requests. Or worse, she was simply left off emails altogether. Hartsfield and Co., always a competitive place, suddenly felt hostile, its glass walls now barriers rather than windows. At first, Emily tried to rationalize the shift as mere office politics. But then, rumors began to circulate, insidious, persistent, and always vague. She overheard two junior consultants muttering near the elevators, their giggles abruptly silenced when she passed. Later that afternoon, she entered a meeting room to find a conversation halting mid-sentence, 3 pairs of eyes avoiding hers. In the women's restroom, snippets of talk about ambition and stepping on toes echoed off the tiles. Even her closest ally, a project coordinator who'd once praised Emily's attention to detail, started keeping her distance. The source of the rumors remained murky, but the effects were unmistakable. Emily's recommendations and comments, once acknowledged, now landed in discussions like stones dropped in a well, heard but never resurfacing. She spotted slides in a presentation that echoed her past suggestions, claimed by others, or edited until her fingerprints disappeared. When a minor error occurred in a finance report, a calculation she'd flagged days before but no one had acted on. The blame fell squarely, almost effortlessly, at her feet. But perhaps the most crushing blow came from management itself. Richard Wallace had always wielded power with studied precision, but now his antagonism became far more pointed. In a large division meeting, he pulled up a spreadsheet for review and, without warning, called out what he called questionable methodologies in Emily's work. His words were formal, but the undertone was unmistakably personal. "We need to be careful when trusting data," he intoned, "especially data that hasn't been vetted by experienced hands." No one rose to defend Emily. Some seemingly cheered her embarrassment with gleeful expressions, just subtle enough to escape censure. The office hierarchy, though never spoken, became painfully clear. The senior partners, nearly all men, many of whom played golf with Richard, operated in a closed inner circle. Important decisions were hashed out at exclusive lunches, on rooftop bars, or in unmarked boardrooms. Mentorships, career advice, and the kind of casual trust that led to advancement seldom trickled toward employees like Emily. She saw it clearly. Women, especially those who showed ambition or intelligence, were isolated, their influence contained. Conversations about diversity and inclusion in HR seminars now rang hollow. Burdened by this new reality, Emily struggled to focus. Her already long days stretched into nights, not just with work, but anxious replaying of conversations in her mind. She wondered which of her colleagues believed the rumors and which simply lacked the courage to defy Richard's narrative. Even as she kept up her meticulous routines, a growing sense of injustice gnawed at her resolve. Any misstep, she realized, might be construed as confirmation of the doubts now swirling around her. One evening, after another day spent watching her contributions dissolve into silence, Emily sat alone at her desk beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. An email notification, a logistical update on an upcoming project, arrived, her name conspicuously absent from the recipient list. She realized with a chill just how far she had slipped from the company's inner workings despite her senior title. Glancing out the office window, the city that once beckoned with opportunity now towered coldly in the dark. Emily understood that the obstacles she faced were not simply professional, but structural and deeply entrenched. This was more than a clash with a difficult boss. It was a ruthless demonstration of how power protected itself and how easy it was for a single silenced voice to disappear beneath the roar of the system. With mounting uncertainty and isolation, Emily's world narrowed. But beneath the cloud of injustice, something resilient took root, a stubborn refusal, still quiet for now, to let her story end this way. The crushing blow. Early one Monday morning, as Emily meticulously organized her desk and prepared for the week ahead, there was an unexpected knock at her glass office door. Two members of the company's internal audit team, their faces unreadable, stepped inside with carefully measured politeness. "Can we have a word, Ms. Turner?" they asked, their tone making it clear that this was not a request. A ripple of anxiety coursed through her, but she forced a professional smile and followed them out. The three walked briskly through quiet corridors toward a small, stark conference room. On the table lay a thick manila folder marked "Confidential." Richard Wallace was there already, sitting rigidly at the head of the table with two members of HR beside him. Emily's heart pounded as they explained the situation. There was an active investigation into a series of questionable transactions linked to the Btch project, the very account she had dedicated countless hours to. "We found discrepancies in the budget allocation and reimbursement claims under your name," an auditor began, sliding printouts of financial reports across the table. The documentation appeared flawless, each transaction stamped and signed with her digital credentials. A quiet outrage and bewilderment gripped Emily. She recognized some of the figures, but many entries and emails were unfamiliar. As they pressed her for explanations, Richard remained silent, his eyes fixed on her with an unnerving mixture of feigned concern and concealed satisfaction. By the time the questioning ended, the accusations had become chillingly explicit. Emily stood accused, at least unofficially, of serious financial misconduct, embezzlement. If proven, the consequences would be career-ending. Still reeling, she defended herself calmly and repeatedly, insisting on a full forensic review. The auditors seemed unmoved. Emily suspected foul play, but in the moment, without evidence, her voice felt thin. Word of the investigation swept through office grapevines faster than she thought possible. Emily noticed it almost immediately. Colleagues she'd mentored avoided eye contact. Longtime collaborators forwarded her calls to voicemail or replied to messages with one-sentence formality. The open office now felt like a maze of glass walls and 1,000 watching, judging eyes. As internal audit staff combed through her computer files and demanded access to her emails and work devices, Emily's sense of privacy shattered. She was temporarily relieved of all client-facing duties, a subtle yet devastating exile from her professional life. Her badge still opened doors, but every interaction left her feeling more isolated. Even those who did not believe she was capable of wrongdoing steered clear, afraid of attracting Richard's scrutiny themselves. The effect on Emily was profound. She spent sleepless nights replaying every transaction, every login, and every note scribbled in the margins of yellow legal pads. She scoured her sent folders, frantically searching for anything that might prove her innocence. Her mind reeled with questions. How had her credentials been used? Who could have orchestrated such a well-planned setup? Why did none of her supposed friends step forward? The isolation grew oppressive. She remembered voices whispering near the coffee machine, fragments of rumors. She always worked late, maybe too late. Ambition like that, it crosses lines. Her network shrank to just a few curt pleasantries in the halls. Most days, her sole moments of quiet support came in the form of a silent nod from a few junior female staffers, their eyes full of private worry but unable to risk any more than empathy at a distance. Worst of all, Emily could sense her own faith wavering. She wondered if anyone would believe her if she fought back. What would it cost her? And yet, in flashes of stubborn clarity, she knew this accusation was more than personal. It was part of a culture that had always found ways to shut women like her out and ensure they never belonged. One evening, After hours of fruitless searching and mounting despair, Emily sat in her parked car outside the office, gripped by a suffocating sense of betrayal. She let her forehead rest against the steering wheel and forced herself to breathe. A message from her childhood echoed in her mind. Never let someone else decide what you're worth. The world she had poured herself into now seemed determined to spit her out. Unbeknownst to Richard and her other accusers, a new resolve began forming in Emily. Even as her reputation teetered on the brink, she realized that if she could find the cracks in the scheme, expose how perfectly the evidence had been manufactured against her, she might not only save herself, but prove to every observer that integrity could outlast even the most calculated injustice. For now, though, the full weight of the crushing blow threatened to bury her. But deep beneath the rubble, something in Emily refused to break. Refusing to surrender. Emily sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, the glow of her laptop illuminating tired eyes and a clenched jaw. Outside, the city never slept. Sirens and distant horns drifted through the open window, but Emily barely noticed. On the screen, spreadsheets, email archives, and transaction logs stacked on top of each other, evidence of her relentless hunt for the truth. The accusation of embezzlement echoed in her mind, bouncing against memories of every painstaking hour she had poured into her work. For days, she had cycled through outrage, shame, and isolation. But in the hollow that fear had carved out in her heart, something far tougher was stirring. An unwillingness to be crushed by an injustice not of her own making. The trauma of the accusation still stung, but Emily found herself drawing on lessons her father had shared in her childhood. You fight for what's right, even when you're standing alone, he had told her, his hands calloused from a lifetime of honest labor. Now, more than ever, her resolve was being tested. Her first instinct was to gather information and retrace all her steps, trusting the facts to clear her name where office politics had not. Emily made meticulous lists of dates, financial codes, and the digital fingerprints tied to each disputed expense. She created a spreadsheet mapping who had access to which systems and when, hunting for missing gaps or digital trails left behind by someone else. As she worked, Emily realized how formidable her adversaries must be. The emails and approvals in question seemed, on the surface, airtight. Her login, her IP address, her name on every line. But the cleaner the evidence looked, the more suspicious it felt. She knew only someone with significant technical knowledge or privileged access could replicate her credentials so seamlessly. Thinking back to late nights in the office, she remembered the fleeting glances from the IT contractor, a man named Tom who rarely spoke but always seemed present for after-hours maintenance. Digging deeper into her email logs, she noticed a few password reset requests she couldn't recall making, timed suspiciously around project deadlines. Yet even as the scope of the betrayal grew more complex, Emily's resolve only sharpened. She set up a private, encrypted email account and began forwarding sensitive findings to herself, wary that her work devices could be monitored. She drafted a timeline of events on pen and paper, cross-referencing entries with security logs she'd managed to export before her computer was taken for review. Small discoveries, odd logins during weekends, approvals time-stamped after midnight, felt like breadcrumbs scattered toward a larger conspiracy. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Emily knew how entrenched Richard's power was in the firm. He had built layers of loyalty and created a culture where doubt could silence voices faster than any order from the top. She would need someone who understood the game and had survived it. Someone who had once gotten close to exposing Richard's abuses before vanishing from the company's internal radar. That was when she remembered Sarah Jacobs. Sarah had been a project manager, a quiet force of nature known for mentoring junior staff and challenging upper management with data-driven arguments. 2 years before, Sarah had unexpectedly left the company. Rumors hinted at a difference in values with a senior executive, but most people simply shrugged and moved on. Emily now realized she had never directly asked Sarah about her departure. Without hesitating, Emily pulled out her phone and searched for Sarah's number. The connection rang 5 times before the line clicked, and Sarah's familiar voice answered, tentative but warm. "Sarah, it's Emily Turner. From Hartsfield. I know it's late, but—" "Emily," Sarah interrupted gently. "I wondered if you'd ever call." The relief in Sarah's voice was palpable. The 2 women quickly agreed to meet at a nondescript diner on the city's edge, away from anyone's prying corporate eyes. Emily arrived early, her nerves taut, and watched as Sarah, older, a little more guarded than Emily remembered, slipped into the seat across from her. They wasted little time on pleasantries. Emily explained the false accusations, the mounting evidence against her, and her suspicion that Richard might have orchestrated the entire scheme. She listed the technical oddities she'd uncovered, the patterns of exclusion and silence among her colleagues, and the chilling efficiency with which her reputation had been dismantled. Sarah listened, her expression grave but entirely unsurprised. Then quietly, she laid out her own story, a carbon copy of the injustice Emily was facing. She, too, had been assigned to a high-stakes account, only to have critical errors pinned on her through doctored records and manipulated system access logs. When she tried to protest, she was isolated, her projects moved to others, her performance reviews suddenly dropping from exceeds expectations to needs improvement. Ultimately, faced with mounting pressure and quiet threats to her professional standing, Sarah had chosen to walk away rather than fight a war she'd been told she could never win. "I always thought it was just me," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "That's how he wins," Sarah replied. "He makes you believe you're alone. That way, no one dares to speak up, and those who try are gone before people notice." They sat in silence for a while, the enormity of the situation settling over them like a heavy fog. But then something fundamental shifted in the space between them. A determination born not just of personal anger, but of solidarity. Emily outlined her plan to continue gathering evidence and document every detail. Dates, signatures, device IDs, access logs. Sarah, savvy and cautious from hard-earned experience, suggested expanding their approach. "We need a pattern, not just your case, but evidence that Richard has done this before. If we can show it's systemic, not personal, we'll have a shot." They agreed to operate in parallel, Sarah leveraging contacts from her tenure at the company, while Emily focused on technical anomalies and collecting supporting testimony. They created an encrypted folder stored outside the company's system, each contributing findings regularly and flagging potential risks. A meeting with IT here, a suspicious delay in HR communication there. Stepping back outside the diner, Emily felt the weight on her shoulders steady, no longer quite so unbearable. The fight was only beginning, but for the first time since her world had been turned upside down, Emily didn't feel outmatched. Returning home in the early morning hours, she pulled the curtains, closed, and stashed her research in a locked drawer. There was still much she didn't know. Who else in the firm might be complicit? How high up the rot went? And whether Richard's allies would sniff out their investigation before they were ready. But Emily now went to bed with a glimmer of hard-won hope, knowing she was no longer fighting alone. Her story, she vowed, would not end with surrender to a system built to keep her silent. And as she drifted into a restless but determined sleep, Emily realized that for the first time in weeks, she felt not defeated, but dangerous. The Silent Alliance. In the weeks that followed their clandestine meeting, Emily and Sarah fell into an unspoken rhythm, a quiet, calculated partnership forged out of mutual trust and necessity. Where once Emily had felt isolated in her pain and outrage, she now had a comrade in arms who understood not just the facts of her battle, but the unspoken wounds that came with it. Their communication was carefully orchestrated. No text messages or office emails, no meetings scheduled in Outlook. Instead, they operated in the liminal spaces of their lives, as if carrying out a secret mission beneath the watchful eyes of Hartsfield and Kosumhiku. Late at night, when the city dulled to a hush, Emily and Sarah would convene at obscure coffee shops, never the same one twice, always careful to choose places far from their office's midtown orbit. They used encrypted email addresses and burner phones to transmit sensitive documents, bank records, security logs, policy handbooks. Emily became adept at scanning files in her apartment by the glow of a desk lamp, obscuring her digital footprint with new VPNs and digital aliases. It felt both terrifying and empowering, a surreal reversal of the bureaucratic orderliness that had shaped most of her career. The deeper they dug, the clearer the patterns became. There were unmistakable echoes of Sarah's story in Emily's predicament, and hints that others, women mostly, but a few men as well, had suffered similar orchestrated downfalls at Richard's hands. One by one, the dots connected. Abrupt departmental transfers, unexplained demotions, glowing performance reviews turned suddenly negative, emails from HR full of legalese and warnings to move on. Sarah tapped into old contacts, quietly sounding out former co-workers now scattered among rival firms and startups. Though some answered with only terse politeness, others responded with guarded relief. Yes, there had been threats. Yes, they'd noticed evidence vanishing from company databases. Yes, something was wrong. Trust was their most precious and most fragile resource. Both women understood that even the most sympathetic colleagues could become liabilities if pressed by management or lured by the promise of favor. In the elevator and cafeteria lines, Emily learned to master the small talk, projecting calm and professionalism while her mind raced with code names and clandestine plans. Sarah, wise from her scars, schooled Emily in subtlety, how to seed questions innocently, how to store backup files securely, how to know when someone's body language betrayed a hidden agenda. Their alliance was built on shared vigilance. Every success, a new thread connecting Richard to falsified approvals, a former employee's willingness to testify, a recovered email from a supposedly wiped server, was met not with celebration, but with a simple nod and the resolve to keep going. At first, the secrecy gnawed at Emily. She was used to the open collaboration of project management, to sharing credit and talking through problems in daylight. But as the weeks unfolded, she recognized a new kind of strength in Sarah and eventually, in herself. The tenacity to fight quietly for what mattered most. They designed a meticulous timeline of Richard's alleged misconduct, overlaying it with HR actions and IT system logs. It became clear that he never acted alone. There was always a buffer, a lackey in the IT department to rubber stamp suspicious password resets, a mid-level manager to carry out the difficult conversations with those headed for ouster, a long-serving HR director who spun grievances into cautionary tales and discouraged whistleblowing with off-the-record warnings. The rot, Emily realized, was less a single cancer and more a tangled network of self-interests grown over years in the shadows of boardrooms and back elevators. With every new discovery, the alliance strengthened. Emily's anxiety, though never fully subsiding, transformed from helpless dread into calculated risk assessment. She no longer jumped at every hallway glance or calendar invite from upper management. Instead, she monitored their moves with a strategist's eye, cross-referencing Richard's lunch meetings and after-hours office exits with the flow of confidential information in department channels. Sarah, meanwhile, became the lead in external contact, arranging encrypted Zoom calls with legal advisors specializing in employment law, as well as with advocacy groups focused on workplace equity and harassment. This next layer of their alliance brought unexpected clarity. The legal consultant, referred by a friend of Sarah's from graduate school, listened to their findings, provided advice on evidence preservation, and insisted on documenting not just what they had found, but how they had obtained it. "Chain of custody is everything," she told them. "It's not enough to be right. You have to be able to show your work convincingly to those who'd rather believe the company's side." The most delicate challenge was gauging whom, if anyone, they could recruit from inside Hartsfield. Emily took to lingering near the few other women in management during all-hands meetings or training sessions, watching for the telltale flicker in their eyes when Richard's name was spoken. With patience, she formed quiet alliances. Iso, reserved compliance analyst who'd quietly filed 3 separate formal complaints against middle management. A marketing lead who'd been given career counseling after a string of successful campaigns were credited to her male subordinates. Still, secrecy was everything. Emily kept these exchanges brief and coded, never saying too much or storing notes where anyone could find them. One slip, Sarah warned, and the entire investigation could be compromised. They both knew that Richard's power came not just from his position, but from the pervasive fear he inspired. At times, Emily questioned whether their incremental progress could withstand the weight of corporate inertia and decades of silent complicity. Yet, piece by piece, the evidence grew impossible to ignore. One night, as a gray dawn broke over the city, Emily and Sarah gathered in Sarah's apartment, paperwork spread across the kitchen table. The room silent but for the shuffling of pages. They compared what they had built, a dossier detailing years of manipulation, sabotage, and legal gray areas. Each file, each testimony, and each email printout represented not just hours of work, but a reclamation of voice from those who had been systematically silenced. For the first time since the ordeal began, Emily felt something close to hope. Not hope in a tidy, happy ending sense, but in the awareness that what she and Sarah had built together, a web of facts, allies, and truth, had finally begun to outweigh the loneliness and fear that had first driven them together. In the quiet, Sarah looked at Emily and managed a smile. "Whatever happens next, we're not invisible anymore," Sarah said, her voice steady, the first hint of defiance lighting her eyes. Emily nodded, feeling the reality of the moment settle into her bones. Their alliance was still a fragile thing, but it was theirs, impossible to take away. The sun came up, casting its first rays across the table and their mosaic of records and notes, a silent witness to an alliance that had already changed the course of 2 lives and, perhaps, would soon shake the foundations of Hartsfield & Company, the tightening noose. As the days passed, the pressure at Hartsfield & Company escalated in subtle, chilling increments. The company's polished glass and polished routines did little to mask an undercurrent of anxiety that swept through the hallways with every whispered rumor and coded glance. At the epicenter of this tempest, Emily and Sarah's alliance held steady, but not unchallenged. Each step they took forward seemed to be met by new barriers, as if the very walls of the office were closing in around them. Richard Wallace had always been a figurehead of control and charisma, but now, sensing unrest, he turned that calculating focus on rooting out dissent. Meetings once bounded by predictable office tension now crackled with a nervous edge. Richard's gaze lingered too long on certain names during morning briefings. Questions that should have been routine audits became veiled interrogations, delivered with icy politeness and camouflaged threats. Emily noticed how rapidly the atmosphere had shifted. The male-dominated management team still moved in their closed formation, tight and impenetrable. But now their conversations paused altogether when she or Sarah walked past. Rumors had always circulated through Hartsfield, but now uncertainty was woven with fear. Even her few remaining allies, those quiet, sidelong nods of solidarity in an elevator or copy room, began to dissipate. For many, the risk of association was too high. Emily understood. She saw coworkers with families and mortgages weighing the balance between personal justice and collective silence. It only made her more resolute. But within the walls of Richard's power, Sarah and Emily were being watched more closely than ever. One afternoon, after a productive but cautious exchange in the break room, Emily noticed a junior IT staffer lingering by the printer, eyes darting from a clipboard to the two women and back again. Later, Sarah's keycard malfunctioned at the parking garage gate. A trivial inconvenience, but tinged with the unmistakable mark of surveillance. The company's systems team, historically reactive, suddenly became proactive about routine security sweeps, demanding access to employees' devices with mounting frequency. Emily and Sarah both began receiving vague invitations for random compliance interviews, always alone, always at the worst possible times. Any slip, the women knew, could be catastrophic. Their encrypted notes and backup drives traveled with them everywhere now. Nothing, not a password, not an offhand comment, was left unsecured. The tension pressed on Emily's nerves, turning every routine interaction into a performance, every conversation into a chess match. Casual Friday jokes in the break room became loaded with double meanings as colleagues tried to gauge which way the wind was blowing. It wasn't just the scrutiny that tightened the net, but a shift in Richard's tactics. Rather than direct confrontation, he orchestrated a subtle campaign of intimidation and psychological strain. A key project that Emily was meant to lead was abruptly reassigned to a male colleague, an act followed by feigned apologies. Just for optics, you know how sensitive this account is. Performance reviews were strategically rescheduled, sandwiching Emily and Sarah between appointments meant to run late and ruin their carefully planned meetings. Richard's sarcasm now carried an edge as hard as steel, and in private, he made clear that everyone was replaceable. As more male colleagues sensed the undercurrent, some watched with growing discomfort but shrank from speaking out, afraid of risking their own standing. A few, more emboldened by proximity to power, began to echo Richard's dismissiveness. Comments that once would have seemed too cruel, even for office banter, slipped into casual conversation. Jokes about restless ambition and playing the victim, always loudly enough for Emily or Sarah to overhear. For Sarah, the onslaught was déjà vu, a cruel reminder of the forces that had driven her from Hartsfield years before. For Emily, every slight was a new wound, but also a motivator, a reminder of why silence was not an option. One night, the threat became frighteningly real. Sarah discovered that files she had hidden on a cloud account were accessed from an unfamiliar IP address. It was a digital fingerprint, clear evidence that their activities were being monitored far beyond what was standard company protocol. For the first time, panic clawed at Emily's resolve. The walls weren't just metaphorical anymore. They could follow her home. Would all her efforts be undone by a single vulnerability in their fortress of secrecy? The next morning, the two met in a nearly empty cafe before work, the conversation hushed by the whir of an ancient espresso machine. Sarah looked more tired than Emily had ever seen her. "We're running out of time," Sarah said simply, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped coffee mug. "They're on to us. We need to adapt. Fast." Emily nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. They needed to split their files, diversify their communication channels, and hide their evidence in plain sight. Sarah would start working remotely whenever possible, blaming a family health crisis to reduce her office footprint and digital exposure. Emily would ramp up her professional visibility, publicly attending company events, asking more questions in meetings, to create the illusion of normalcy and throw off suspicion. But Emily also knew something had to change beyond their technical approach. The office's silence, the willingness of so many to look away in the face of abuse, was Richard's greatest weapon. If they were to succeed, they needed to plant the seeds of doubt in his camp. That afternoon, during a weekly managers' meeting, Emily steered the conversation toward transparency and ethics, carefully threading her words so that no one could accuse her of straying from protocol. She referenced HR best practices and suggested a peer review process for high-level financial decisions to bring us in line with other industry leaders. The room turned frosty. Richard's jaw ticked, just enough that Emily recognized the warning. But a few managers exchanged glances, and Emily caught a flicker of interest from a young compliance officer in the back row. After the meeting, the compliance officer approached. "I appreciated your comments," she said quietly. "If you ever need to talk, my door's open." It was only a breath of hope, but it was enough to remind Emily that, despite the suffocating isolation, she and Sarah were not entirely alone. Still, the danger was growing every day. That week, Sarah narrowly avoided a trap during a routine audit, questions about old projects twisted to imply malpractice, an email forwarded out of context to smear her judgment. Emily was put on the spot to deliver results for an account in half the usual time. The message was clear. Make a mistake, and the repercussions would be swift and public. Undeterred, the women doubled down on their preparations. They carefully cataloged every suspicious interaction, every attempt at intimidation, every sign that the net was tightening. The evidence, once scattered and anecdotal, now took shape as a grim tapestry, a record of systemic abuse and retaliation that could not be explained away by simple office politics. But as the noose tightened, something else changed too. The pockets of silence in the company grew thinner. Whispers of unrest began to reach Emily, coded in casual hallway comments and lingering looks from colleagues who had previously kept their distance. Word of Richard's overreach, his paranoia, his vendettas, was seeping through the cracks of his own walls. On another late-night phone call, Emily said, "He's losing control, Sarah. He's coming after us because we're close." "Close, but not there yet," Sarah replied, her voice tired but unwavering. "Give him enough rope. He'll hang himself." With courage hard-won from months of fear and solidarity, Emily and Sarah pressed on, certain of one thing. The tighter Richard pulled the noose, the closer he drew them to a reckoning that neither silence nor intimidation could prevent. Turning the tables. The tension that had shadowed Hartsfield and Company for months reached a fever pitch as autumn fell on New York. Emily had grown used to surviving on adrenaline and coffee, but now a sharper purpose took hold. Each coded message with Sarah, each late-night scan of files and whispered hallway conversation, felt less like desperation and more like tactical maneuvering in a high-stakes game. The time for defense, Emily realized, was over. The noose Richard had tightened might ensnare him instead, if only they made their move at the perfect moment. The silent alliance had grown. Subtle support had emerged from unexpected quarters. A compliance analyst who quietly shared anomalous audit logs, a project manager who came forward with a mysterious transfer order and notes from long-ago HR warnings, and that young compliance officer whose door was indeed open. Sarah, battle-tested by her own ordeal, guided their growing network with careful discipline. "One leak, and we lose everything," she cautioned, urging evidence to be locked away in password-protected drives, notes destroyed after one use, and every meeting double-blind scheduled through encrypted apps. As the web of trust thickened, so did the weight of what they uncovered. When the puzzle pieces finally fell into place, the blueprint of Richard's abuse of power was clear. At least 5 promising female executives had been demoted or forced out, under a haze of manufactured errors, all in connection with projects Richard himself oversaw. IG logs showed tampering. Approval emails were sent at odd hours from fingerprinted locations Richard's circle controlled. HR wrote boilerplate concern letters echoing nearly identical language. For Emily, the proof stung. She had suspected the patterns for months, but seeing lives disassembled so methodically reminded her that her struggle represented many. But proof meant nothing if it stayed buried, and Richard's surveillance had grown even more invasive. Emily often sensed the eyes of upper management boring into her in meetings, felt the hush as she entered the break room. Sarah's remote work request drew scrutiny, her inbox peppered with oddly formal notes about progress documentation expectations. Every day at the office felt like a gauntlet, passing Richard's icy stare in the elevator, overhearing the poisoned rumors he seeded, knowing her next misstep might be fatal. It was a risk Sarah and Emily knew they had to take. Together, they drafted a confidential dossier. Hundreds of pages of digital records, time-stamped emails, security logs, statements quietly gathered from shaken but determined colleagues willing to tell their stories anonymously. Crucially, Emily insisted their evidence be reviewed by an outside authority before any internal report could disappear into the void, as so many had before. With Sarah's help and the advice of their lawyer, they arranged a secure transfer of the entire dossier to the company's legal counsel, as well as to 3 members of the board who were not part of Richard's orbit. Just before dawn on a fateful Monday, Emily clicked send. The next 48 hours were a blur of anticipation and terror. There was no announcement, only a shift in the weather. The normally brisk tone of HR emails became urgent, and Richard was seen leaving meetings with furrowed brows, his composure now visibly cracking. That Wednesday, a company-wide calendar alert arrived, not from Richard but from the office of Hartsfield's CEO, summoning all managers to an urgent review. Emily's heart hammered as she entered the cavernous conference room. She took her seat amid a sea of stony faces, some familiar, some caught in the undertow of uncertainty. Richard arrived last, his confidence less certain than ever, accompanied by the head of HR and the firm's legal counsel, a woman known for her discretion and icy manner. The meeting began without preamble. The legal counsel addressed the room. Recent findings and allegations regarding mishandling of financial accounts, data tampering, and workplace retaliation have come to the attention of the executive board. Today's meeting is not routine. We are here to discuss and review the evidence. As a thick file was distributed down the table, hard copies of the very documents Emily and Sarah had compiled, it became clear this would not be the cover-up Richard intended. Instead, his name was cited repeatedly. Signatures on dubious approvals, patterns in assignment changes, HR complaints that had never been properly investigated. The data was exacting, irrefutable. Richard's rebuttals, vague claims of administrative error, attempted blame shifting to team members, dismissive remarks about overzealous analysts, fell flat. For once, senior partners did not rally around him, their eyes instead fixed on the facts and on the sudden risk to the company's sterling reputation. The room pulsed with tension as, one by one, several women at the table spoke up, their reluctance falling away in the presence of proof and strength in numbers. Each testimony added a missing thread: gaslighted concerns, rewritten project evaluations, assignments sabotaged by deliberate deadline changes. Emily watched as the tide turned, every new detail further eroding Richard's carefully constructed facade. "I saw my sign-off altered after I'd left for the evening," one manager declared, her voice tense but unwavering. Another offered, "My budget proposals were lost on Richard's desk for weeks, only to be replaced by ones he created." For the first time, Richard's mask slipped. He stammered. The color rose in his cheeks. He could not spin so many voices as delusional or bitter. Facing a wall of evidence and the cold, sharp eyes of board members long resigned to his intimidation, Richard had no cover left. By midday, the CEO herself entered the room, flanked by outside investigators now given full access to company files. An announcement was made. Richard would be suspended from all duties pending a comprehensive investigation. The company would review every one of his project assignments and HR actions from the past 5 years. There would be protections for all witnesses and whistleblowers. As the meeting adjourned, a heavy silence lingered. A silence that wasn't fear, but a collective, stunned relief. Emily was quietly told by HR her name was cleared in the ongoing review. By the end of the day, an internal memo reaffirmed the company's intent to foster a fair and equitable workplace, and for once, employees seemed to believe it. Walking out into the afternoon sun, Emily felt the burden that had pressed on her chest for months finally lift. She wasn't naive enough to believe all would change overnight, but Richard's removal sent a shockwave through the company culture. She hugged Sarah tightly in the shadow of the building. Around them, clusters of women and a few men gathered, sharing tentative, hopeful smiles. For Emily, the victory was less about vindication than about breaking a legacy of silence and fear. She knew the fight would continue, but for the first time, she saw that truth and courage could shatter even the most insidious systems. The truth in the light. Word of Richard Wallace's suspension spread through Hartsfield and Comeding with the force of a summer storm, igniting conversations in every corridor and break room. In the days that followed the emergency board meeting, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly, from brittle tension to something like cautious optimism. For the first time in years, employees dared to wonder whether real change was at hand. Emily Turner, at the heart of it all, could feel the difference immediately. Where once her footsteps drew wary glances and whispered speculation, she was now greeted with nods of respect and sometimes gratitude. Even those who hadn't known the depth of Richard's influence seemed relieved by his absence, as if a miasma had finally lifted from the firm's gleaming hallways. For Emily, the relief was profound but complex. She was officially cleared of all allegations, her record not only restored, but attached to an apology letter from the head of HR. She was invited to return to her previous responsibilities, and management even offered her a lead role in drafting new ethics and compliance guidelines. Yet peace did not come easily. The months of isolation and attack had left scars, quiet moments when anxiety would twist her stomach or she'd startle at an unfamiliar knock. But each day, the weight eased a little more, replaced by hard-won pride. Sarah Jacobs, too, was vindicated. The internal review conducted by the independent group found that her departure was the result of orchestrated retaliation. Hartsfield offered her a formal apology and financial settlement for damages to her career. Though she politely declined an offer to return, Sarah chose instead to act as a consultant, helping shape the company's restorative process. "It's not about a job anymore," she told Emily over coffee. "It's about making sure no one ends up erased the way we nearly were." The changes in the office culture were as startling as they were overdue. In place of closed doors and exclusive cliques, there were now open forums and invitation-only listening sessions where employees could recount their experiences in a safe environment. HR policies were completely overhauled under supervision of an external equity committee. Management implemented an anonymous reporting system, administered outside existing chains of command, for whistleblowers or anyone facing mistreatment. Mandatory anti-retaliation training was scheduled for every manager and above, drawing a clear line between the Hartsfield of the past and the future it aimed to build. One morning, Emily was called before the executive committee, not for interrogation, but for public recognition. As she stood at the head of a conference room, flanked by new faces on the board and the team that had supported her in the shadows, she saw Sarah in the audience mouthing, "You did it." The CEO addressed the room. "Not long ago, our company nearly lost its way. Today, we recognize the courage of those who refuse to let darkness go unchallenged. Let Emily's story remind us of how costly silence can be and how transformative it is when truth is spoken, even at great personal risk. But the new transparency also exposed uncomfortable truths. The full extent of Richard's abuses was laid bare in the review's findings. A nearly decade-long pattern of targeted demotions, forged approvals, and protected inner circle coordination. Former employees came forward to testify, some by video, others through written affidavits. Many were women, some were men who'd run afoul of Richard's ambitions. Together, their stories painted a picture of systemic rot and the courage required to confront it. For many in the firm, the revelations were jarring. "How did it go on for so long?" a junior analyst asked Emily at the elevator one day. Emily paused, considering. The roots of these issues dig deep when people are afraid for their jobs, their reputations, or of standing alone. But we aren't alone anymore. That's our responsibility now. Keep the light on, so fear has nowhere to hide. The changes at Hartsfield rippled outward. Local business journals highlighted the firm's response, noting both its failings and its determination to change course. Some clients reached out to express concerns, others to express support that the company was confronting its issues head-on. A few even asked Emily to speak at client events on the importance of workplace fairness, diversity, and accountability. She found herself sharing hard-won lessons with strangers, lessons forged in late-night anxiety and now transforming the cultural conversation. Among the most significant changes was the creation of the Hartsfield Equity Circle, a committee comprised equally of employees and external advisors tasked with monitoring workplace culture, resolving grievances, and holding leadership accountable. Emily was asked by her peers to be their first chair. While she hesitated, unsure about the permanent weight of the role, she accepted on the condition that the circle have genuine authority and transparent oversight. She didn't want power for herself, but for the process to become sustainable, so that the next person in her situation would never have to stand alone. With Richard gone, pending the outcome of the investigation and the likelihood of legal action mounting, the management team began to reckon with its complicity. Some stepped down voluntarily, others issued public statements acknowledging their failure to intervene. A few tried to disown their connection to Richard's regime, but the culture had changed. Platitudes were now met with skepticism rather than whispered relief. For Sarah, vindication meant more than a line on her resume. It freed her to speak to women's groups, host workshops on resilience in hostile workplaces, and consult nationwide on organizational integrity. She and Emily remained close. Two survivors forged in secrecy, who, in breaking their silence, found a measure of justice and the beginnings of real friendship. The changes inspired others, too. A junior compliance officer told Emily she was now considering a management track herself, reassured by the new transparency and protection for whistleblowers. A mid-career professional who'd nearly quit wrote an anonymous note. "Thank you for reminding us it's not weakness to do what's right. It's the only thing that makes this place worth working for." And yet neither Emily nor Sarah saw their story as ending here. The trauma, the risk, and the hard-won changes were never forgotten. Instead, they became the foundation for a new kind of ambition, one not rooted in personal advancement, but in ensuring Hartsfield & Co. would never again become a place where silence was priced higher than truth. Emily looked around, no longer feeling like an outsider in her fishbowl office. Now the view reminded her not of isolation, but of the possibility stretching in all directions. A future built on honesty, vigilance, and the courage to speak up. For the first time in her career, Emily understood that the light of truth had not only exposed injustice, but seeded hope. And as morning sun flooded through the skyline, she knew this was only the beginning of what she Sarah and their silent alliance had set in motion. Endings and new beginnings. The year was winding down, the skyline outside Emily's office dusted with snow, as the final phase of transformation swept Hartsfield and Kono. What had started with silence and suspicion now moved, painfully and triumphantly, toward accountability and possibility. The public reckoning was nearly complete. Richard's fate rested with outside investigators, but his absence felt permanent, a ghost replaced by a new atmosphere of transparency and cautious hope. Emily's days, once burdened by anxiety and vigilant watching, slowly filled with a different kind of weight, the responsibility of shaping what came next. She no longer walked the hallways with averted gaze. Colleagues stopped her to share ideas, concerns, even encouragement. The walls that had once reverberated with secrets now echoed with purposeful conversations. It wasn't flawless. There were stray doubts, some pockets of resistance, and the ongoing challenge of trust still being rebuilt. But Hartsfield felt unmistakably changed. In the weeks that followed, the company introduced sweeping new policies centered on equity, support for female professionals, and zero tolerance for retaliation. The Hartsfield Equity Circle, with Emily as its first chair, set up weekly forums where grievances could be heard without fear. Small, practical changes made a difference. Flexible work schedules for parents, mentorship programs pairing junior and senior women across departments, and transparency around pay equity. Every employee received dedicated training, not the rote, box-checking kind, but interactive sessions that forced hard conversations and real growth. One morning, the board offered Emily a promotion, a senior leadership role that would put her at the heart of decision-making. It was both an honor and a challenge. For weeks, she wrestled with the choice. To accept meant visibility, power, and the chance to amplify change, but also more scrutiny and the risk of being subsumed by the very institution she had helped reform. Over coffee with Sarah, Emily voiced her doubts. I worry that if I step up, I won't have the freedom to push against the current. What if I become the system? Sarah smiled, a mix of empathy and resolve in her gaze. If you don't lead, then who? You've proven you're not just a survivor, but someone who can see the cracks and repair them. This is your chance to protect what's been built. And if you ever feel yourself getting lost, you still have us, your allies, the circle, and everyone who watched what you did. With a renewed conviction, Emily accepted. The announcement rippled across the company, and soon after, through industry news. Hartsfield became a quiet case study in how organizations could confront internal rot, not only repairing harm, but forging cultures where speaking out wasn't punished, and ambitious women were given as much support as scrutiny. Empowered by the firm's genuine turnaround, voices began to multiply. Emily met with younger women from accounting and IT who, inspired by her leadership, shared their stories and ambitions without fear. Some confessed they'd nearly quit during the darkest days. Others admitted they had doubt the company would ever change. But watching you, a newly promoted project lead said, proved that we don't have to accept things as they are. We deserve better, and we can make it happen together. Sarah, now a sought-after consultant for other companies facing similar reckonings, returned often to check in and offer perspective. Together, she and Emily led workshops on ethical leadership, boundary pushing without burnout, and solidarity in the face of pressure. Invitations started rolling in for public speaking, industry panels, even interviews with business journals exploring Hartsfield's turnaround and its impact on broader corporate America. One of the new keystones was a peer-driven support group, employees from every level and background meeting after hours for candid, confidential dialogue. The Circle also established an annual Day of Listening, a firm-wide event dedicated not to work, but to storytelling, moments of resilience, lessons learned from failure, and the triumphs, large and small, that came from refusing to surrender. Yet for all the progress, Emily knew the fight against complacency was ongoing. A handful of senior leaders, uncomfortable with sharing power, chose to step down or retire. Some departed quietly. Others issued public statements about making room for the next generation. Emily made it standard practice to meet departing employees personally. "I want you to know," she told one longtime manager on her last day, "that what happened here will not be forgotten or swept away. It's part of our story, as is your choice to support change." The firm's clients took notice. Some were wary, but most appreciated the openness. Requests increased for Emily to consult with other organizations facing their own growing pains. She gladly shared everything: the pain, the setbacks, the moments she nearly gave in. And always, she credited the silent alliance that had refused to let injustice win. Personally, Emily's world also grew bigger. Freed of anxious self-censorship, she rekindled old friendships, found time for family, and even mentored high school students interested in business ethics. The experiences of the past year had left her stronger and softer. She knew the scars would never quite vanish, but they'd transformed into sources of wisdom. On the eve of the new year, Emily organized an informal gathering, a quiet celebration for those who had fought, supported, and witnessed the transformation. The office lights glowed softly against the snow, laughter and music spilling from the conference room where, months ago, she had faced humiliation and silence. Sarah stood by her side, raising a toast. "To what we started, to what we've survived, and to the future we're still shaping." Outside, the city's hum continued, but inside, hope felt tangible. Colleagues exchanging genuine smiles, new leaders emerging from unexpected places, and trust rebuilt, not as naive optimism, but as hard-won belief in each other. As midnight approached, Emily stepped out onto the terrace, looking out at the city beyond. She reflected, not simply on what had ended, but on everything that was beginning. A future where women did not have to whisper to be heard, where silence wasn't the price of ambition, and where the simple act of refusing to surrender had changed everything. And in that quiet, snowy moment, Emily knew, with certainty, that endings, when faced with courage and solidarity, could always be the start of something better. Ripple effect change, Emily had learned, was never confined to a single place. As winter thawed to spring, the story of Hartsfield and Company became more than an internal reckoning. It was a beacon for others, sending ripples far beyond the office towers and into the lives of countless women and men across the corporate world. The first hints arrived as handwritten letters and emails from strangers landed at Emily's desk. Some were from women freshly navigating workplaces that dismissed their ideas or minimized their voices. Others came from men who admitted they had once looked away and now wanted to know how to be better allies. Former Hartsfield employees, some long gone and scattered across the country, reached out to thank Emily and her circle, sharing how their own careers had been shaped, both for better and worse, by their time at the firm. Their words were equal parts gratitude and confession, and Emily read every line, often late at night, feeling the weight and responsibility of the meaning their victory now carried. Sarah was quick to see the shift. "People are watching, Em. They're hungry for a model. It's like we lit a signal fire." Together, Emily and Sarah began fielding invitations from women's resource groups in companies large and small. They spoke in video conferences for professional networks, at roundtables for diversity in tech, and to alumni from their former universities. Their calendars filled with speaking engagements, sometimes in boardrooms, sometimes in auditoriums. Each time, the questions circled back to the same core anxieties. Can one person really make a difference? What happens if you stand up and no one else does? Are there ways to build alliances in silence until they become too loud to ignore? Emily never pretended the path had been easy. She spoke honestly about fear, setbacks, and the cost of courage. But she also shared the most critical lesson: how collective effort, born of unlikely friendships and quiet persistence, could expose injustice and force powerful change. At Hartsfield, the aftermath of their struggle began radiating outward in layers. The Equity Circle became a model for other companies, with consulting requests coming from firms in different cities looking to replicate its employee-led structure and transparent external oversight. Emily worked with their legal advisor to develop a toolkit for organizations wishing to create similar bodies, including guidelines for anonymous grievance reporting, whistleblower protection, and leadership accountability standards. What surprised Emily most was how these efforts reshaped not only businesses, but broader workplace culture. Stories of transformation at Hartsfield appeared in business magazines, HR journals, even mainstream newspapers. Emily received a request from a prominent national conference on corporate ethics to deliver the keynote on sustaining integrity beyond crisis. She spent weeks crafting her speech, pushing herself to articulate not just principles, but real strategies that could protect others from the isolation and suspicion she had once felt. Within Hartsfield, the journey was far from over. Deep change took patience and tenacity. New leaders joined the circle from departments once considered hostile to reform, skeptical at first, but gradually convinced as they saw how a culture of transparency could improve both team morale and business results. Mid-level managers started recommending their rising stars, regardless of gender or background, for mentorship pairings. Office surveys showed record levels of trust in leadership for the first time in decades. Perhaps most importantly, the stigma of speaking up was dispelled. Employees who once whispered in the kitchen now voiced their ideas and their concerns openly in meetings. One afternoon, Emily watched as a young analyst respectfully challenged a director during a strategy session, bolstered by the knowledge that she would not be punished for her candor. The room was silent for a moment. Then the director nodded and thanked her for her insight. It was a small moment, but to Emily, it felt revolutionary. Sarah, meanwhile, evolved into a national voice on workplace justice. Her consultancy grew almost accidentally. Soon, she was mentoring HR professionals and training law firms on the nuances of handling complex whistleblower cases. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional subcommittee on protecting women and minorities from retaliation in the workplace. A surreal milestone, she admitted to Emily, for someone who had once been forced out under a cloud of suspicion. Outside the firm, the ripple effects reached schools and communities as well. Emily volunteered with nonprofit organizations aimed at empowering young women to enter STEM fields, sharing stories from her journey and breaking down old stereotypes about corporate America. She created a fellowship fund for women pursuing business degrees, funded with part of the consulting fees and honorariums she and Sarah received, ensuring that the next generation would have a supportive path forward. One of her proudest moments came during a visit to a local high school, where she sat in a crowded auditorium and listened as a 17-year-old girl, someone who had read an article about Emily in a magazine, stood and asked, voice trembling, "How do I keep going when it feels like nobody hears me?" Emily paused, then told her, "Start by finding just one other person who believes in you. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the story. And when you get your chance, make sure you leave the door open for the next person behind you." The impact Emily and Sarah had achieved together, planted in the hard ground of injustice and watered by perseverance, now blossomed in places they never imagined. As companies implemented policies based on their model and advocacy groups cited their case as proof that grassroots leadership could make a difference, both women understood they had moved beyond their own survival. They had started a movement, yet the story never fully belonged to them. It belonged to the countless individuals emboldened to push back against silence, the leaders who opened meetings by asking for hard questions, the teams who set up their own equity circles, and the small, private moments of encouragement between colleagues who dared to speak the truth. On a bright spring Saturday, exactly 1 year after Richard's removal, Emily hosted a reunion for the original alliance. Old faces appeared, some from Hartsfield, some from partner firms, some from advocacy networks that had quietly helped along the way. They shared news of continued progress, of firms that now had women in C-suites, of managers who proactively sponsored underrepresented staff, of waves of new hires who seemed to think transparency and fairness were simply the way things had always been. As the afternoon sunlight filtered across the room, Sarah raised her glass. To lighting the path, even when you're not sure where it goes, to refusing to give up, and to making sure no one else has to walk it alone. Laughter and applause followed, but Emily found herself stepping outside for a moment, looking up at the city skyline. The journey that had begun in heartbreak and fear was now a banner of hope for hundreds, maybe thousands of people. For Emily, it was both the closing of a chapter and an invitation to keep building. In that quiet moment, she promised herself to keep listening, to her colleagues, to the next generation, to anyone brave enough to say, "It's time for things to change." Because as the meaning of Hartsfield's story spread, so did its clearest lesson, that the most powerful force for good was never outrage or even perseverance alone, but the willingness to turn pain into purpose until the ripple became a wave.